Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan and this is the annotation of the game you just saw against the chessmaster engine, using some ideas to improve the martial defense. So I'm playing black here, and first let's take a look at the martial defense. The martial defense is when we play black and white starts out with d4, then d5, then c4, the queen's gambit. And now black plays knight to f6, the martial defense. And this defense isn't very popular because white can simply play pawn takes, then knight recaptures, and then the pawn advance e4, chasing away the knight. Knight reads to retreat. We're attacking the pawn on e4, but white can continue development with knight to c3, and this is the main reason why the martial defense isn't popular. White gets an immediate pawn island in the center. Both sides have one knight developed, and it looks like this is a bad opening strategy for black. But there's more to it than meets the eye. Let's say that after the queen's gambit, black plays the martial defense, and white grabs the pawn. Now, black doesn't have to grab the pawn right away because he has two attackers on it. Black can instead play a gambit that is c6, adding three attackers on the pawn. Now, if a random move is played like h3, black can simply grab the pawn back. But if white grabs the pawn, white has a pawn advantage, but after knight takes pawn, we can see that we have another attacker on the pawn on d4. And after, say, knight to f3 to prevent the pawn, white can play the aggressive e5, attacking the pawn. And if, say, knight takes pawn, we can get knight takes knight, pawn takes, and queen takes, king takes queen, knight to g4, threatening the pawn on f2, threatening a fork, and threatening to recapture the pawn. Alternatively, if pawn takes pawn, we get queen takes queen, king takes queen. So the main idea, of course, of this gambit is to prevent the king from castling. Now knight to g4 with the same idea behind it. We are threatening the pawn on f2, we are threatening a fork, and we have two pieces attacking the pawn on e5 with one defender, which leads to an interesting play for black and a lousy position for white. But this wasn't played in the game. Instead, by transposition, bishop to f5 was played after the martial defense. So the exact move order was bishop to f5 first, which is the Ke2 defense actually. Pawn takes. So there's no rush for black in a martial. And now I play knight to f6, threatening to recapture the pawn. And we can see already that with this bishop developed, the martial defense has become stronger, because e5 to get a pawn island is no longer possible with this bishop covering the square. So if white were to try knight to c3 to protect that pawn, I can play knight takes pawn, knight recaptures, now queen takes. And of course this queen is perfectly safe because the only knight that can threaten it is already gone. I'm threatening the pawn on d4. after development of knight to c6. So this leads to a good development for black. So after knight to f3, knight to c6, then if a random move is played, let's say h3, I can strengthen the half open file with rook to d8, or if black plays e3 to strengthen d4, I can play e5, again with the idea to trade off queens and prevent the king from castling. So if pawn takes, queen takes, king takes check, I can castle long with a check, and bishop to d2 is already a better position for black. Of course, this wasn't played. I'm just showing some ideas if alternatives are played. Knight to c3 wasn't played by the chessmaster engine. Instead, knight to f3 was played. So I grab the pawn. We note that a fork is impossible, nor is simply playing e4 to get a pawn island in the center, because simply bishop takes. And now white plays queen to b3, which is a typical move in Ke type of development of the queen's gambit declined. After our bishop has moved, we can see that there is no longer protection on b7. So queen to b3 is played, also adding pressure on the knight on d5. So I play e6, ignoring this pawn for the moment, activating the bishop. Now, if queen takes pawn, which wasn't played, I can play knight to d7, which is necessary because the rook is under attack. Then, if say a random move is played, say h3, I can play knight to b4, threatening check and a fork. And if knight to a3 to defend, we can see that this defense fails after rook to b8, threatening the queen. Queen can take the pawn, but then we can play queen to c8, removing an escape square from the queen. Then after, say, h4, rook to a8, and this queen is lost because there are no longer any escape squares left. So that's what happens after a random move like h3. If a3 is played in order to prevent knight to b4, which is the only logical move, black can play rook to b8. If white plays queen to a6, black can play rook to b6, attacking the queen, queen to c4, and now bishop takes knight, rook recaptures, and bishop takes pawn. And of course the bishop cannot be recaptured because of the discovered attack on the rook. And that way black can get his lost pawn back. Also we can see that we have created an isolated pawn on b2. Queen takes pawn, rook to a8, queen to b7 again. Now knight to b4, simply ignoring this defense, because rook can take rook. So for instance, if a takes b, rook takes, so that doesn't work. Alternatively, if queen takes, we can play bishop takes queen, check, so that doesn't work. What else? If king to d1, we can play bishop to c2, check instead. King to e1, knight to c5, threatening the queen, and of course the knight cannot be recaptured because of queen to d1 checkmate. So we can see that the queen is in a very uncomfortable position after recapturing the pawn on b7 immediately. So let's take it back. This wasn't played. So e6. And instead of queen takes pawn on b7, white plays the more logical move, knight to d2. Now white has support for a pawn break to play e4, which not only creates a pawn center, but also forks both pieces. Additionally, in some cases, this knight blocks the diagonal in case of a check. So this is definitely better development. I continue with bishop to b4. Now, if I were to try knight to b4 instead, white can play e4, knight to c2, check, and queen can take. So we can see that this pawn is useful in blocking the diagonal. So we have to abandon the idea of the fork for the moment. Bishop to b4 instead, and try to get rid of the knight. White plays a3. I play bishop to a5, keeping on the pressure. Now queen takes pawn. I play knight to d7 in order to protect the rook. b4, rook to b8, threatening the queen. Queen moves to a6, and now bishop takes pawn. Pawn recaptures, knight takes, and now I have a fork between the queen and a fork between the king and the rook. So the queen needs to move. White grabs the pawn on a7, knight to c2 check, king to d1, knight takes rook, queen recaptures, I castle, white plays e4 to get the pawn center, bishop to g4, h3, bishop takes knight, knight recaptures, c5. So we see we're capitalizing on the uncastled king, because the king needed to recapture a piece. If pawn recaptures, knight recaptures with a check. Bishop to f4, developing with tempo. So rook to a8, also with tempo. The queen needs to move. Queen goes to b2. Now queen to a5, so we have a strong presence on the a file. Bishop to d3, hoping to add some protection to the king. Pawn takes pawn, queen recaptures. Now e5, this forks both pieces. There are three ways for black to recapture. If knight recaptures, which wasn't played, I can recapture. Bishop can recapture. But then rook to d8 attacks the queen, discovered attack on the bishop, and there's also an attack on the bishop on e5. So if queen to b2, for instance, rook takes bishop. If queen recaptures, I can play queen to a2 to threaten the pawn on f2. Then if say bishop to d2, I can develop and take advantage of the uncastled king with rook to d8, bishop to c2, then rook to c8 with two attackers on the bishop on c2. So that also doesn't seem to work. Let's see what else white may try. Instead of knight takes pawn, he can also grab the knight on d7, and this move was played. So I grab the bishop to recapture the minor piece. White plays king to e2. If instead he plays a random move, let's say h4, I can play rook f to d8, of course. Queen moves, rook takes bishop, so that doesn't work. Alternatively, I can play queen to a1 check, king moves, and grab the rook. This just shows how much trouble white is in with his uncastled king. Of course, a random move wasn't played. Black plays king to e2 to protect the bishop. And now, to continue play, we need to take a look at our rooks. And our rooks are not positioned very well, because they are both out of play. And there are a lot of open files, of course, and targets on the D, C, and B file. So we need to find the sweet spots for our rooks. And in fact, if we find the correct places, we will win the game. And if we don't, we will lose the game, or the game will be a draw. So first, rook to d8. This develops the rook with tempo on the open file. White plays queen to c6. Now rook to c8, also developing the rook. Rook to b7, but this still isn't good enough. Rook to b8, and now white plays queen to c6. Now both our rooks are on their sweet spots and are their best developed position. Now we'll show you why. Now we can play queen to a2 check. And let's see what defenses white has against it. If queen to c2 is played, we can see why we needed to develop our rook on b8. Because rook to b2 wins the queen. So that defense doesn't work. If instead knight to d2 to block the check, we can see why our rook needed to be developed on d8. Because now rook takes bishop, king recaptures, rook to d8 check, king moves, rook takes knight check, king f3, and we are in the forced mate. Rook takes pawn. This is just an example to continue. Queen to e2 check, g5 check, rook takes pawn check, queen to h5 check, queen to g5 check, queen to g3 checkmate. So that's also possible. So let's move it back. We see that queen to c2 doesn't work because of our rook on b8. We see that knight to d2 doesn't work because of our rook to d8. White instead plays bishop to c2. And now we have to find another sweet spot for our rook. Rook to c8. And again we are targeting all the pieces at once. If queen to d6, which wasn't played, simply rook takes check, knight can block, rook takes check, queen takes, and rook to b2. Black will lose his queen. And black will win the game. Rook to b1 was played instead. So we need to be a little bit careful because of a back rank mate. So if rook takes, check, rook takes, back rank mate. So that, of course, can't happen. Instead, we play queen takes bishop check, queen recaptures, rook takes check, and we have a check and attack on the rook on b1. So king to d1, rook takes rook check, king takes, and rook to f1. And not only are we up an exchange, but also we can grab a few free pawns. The pawn on f2 is lost. King to d3, rook takes pawn, knight to e1 to protect the pawn on g2, g5, e5, king to g7, king to d4, king to g6, h4. I take the pawn, knight to d3, rook to d2, getting ready to trade off pieces and win on my pawn advantage. King to c3, take. Now the fastest mate would have been f3, after which, if say pawn takes, I can promote. Or if king to e3, pawn takes, king to f2, and h3, and we can see that the promotion cannot be stopped. I can simply grab the pawn on e5 and if necessary promote with the f-pawn. Instead I played a more flexible move, king to f5, getting ready to move either to g4 or grab the pawn on e5. White goes to e2, so I grab the pawn, king to f3, king to f5, and I'll just continue the game with little annotation. Eventually, white can no longer stop the promotion. I grab a few queens, a few checks, and that's the end of the game. So I hope you enjoyed this variation on the Tarrasch defense against the Queen's Gambit, using some elements of the Keras defense, and that it gave you some ideas in your play. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment and have a great evening.